We're going to go through the pathophysiology of the stress response as it relates to labor and as it relates to, sustaining the pregnancy, because it's a little bit more complicated than what we've talked about in the past. And so I briefly reviewed this in another video. This is a little bit more in depth, but in terms of what you need to know about all of the biological processes involved in pregnancy and reproductive health, this one is probably one of the more important ones because it fits more in line with everything else that we've talked about. And once you understand this pathophysiology, you will understand why we have racial health inequities. So let's begin. Just as a review, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the physiology of the adrenal glands, or if it's been a while, remember the adrenal glands? That's the A of the HPA axis. They actually secrete more than just cortisol. So let me get my annotation. So they actually secrete stress hormones. So that's the cortisol, right? And then the epinephrine, norepinephrine. Okay, we're familiar with that. But they also secrete sex hormones. This is DHEA, which you don't have to remember. I want you to remember androgens, which are like the male hormones, although like both a male, female, everyone has these hormones. They secrete the sex hormones. And then also the salt hormone. So this is involved in that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone axis that we talked about when we were talking about stress physiology on cardiovascular system. So we briefly mentioned aldosterone, but you don't have to really memorize that. Just know that there are more than one thing, more than one hormone secreted from the adrenal glands. And that should help moving forward. So more review. So you've seen this slide before. Remember the role of CRH, this hormone that we usually associate with the H of the HPA axis, right, is also secreted by the placenta. And it actually has a different effect whenever it's secreted by the placenta. It's no longer a negative feedback system. It's actually a positive feedback system. So placenta secretes CRH, and that stimulates the adrenal glands. If you have that right there, like the rest should make sense a little bit more. So the placenta secretes CRH, that flows into the fetal system and stimulates the adrenal glands. In this particular example, or what we're focused on right now, is really early on in pregnancy. So early on, before the adrenal glands are, well developed, whenever the CRH stimulates the adrenal glands, it mostly stimulates the release of androgens. And going back one slide, remember, the adrenal glands release more than just one hormone. So it's not just cortisol, it's all of these things. But right now we're talking about the androgens. So CRH early on in pregnancy stimulates adrenal glands of the fetus to secrete androgens. Now the androgens flow back through the blood flow to the placenta, and placenta also has the capability of changing those androgens to estrogens. So that's just like a chemical change, easy enough. Now, that estrogen goes to the mom and really helps stimulate uterine blood flow, uterine growth. And in a minute, we're also going to talk about the other ways that estrogen stimulates the uterus, but this is early on in pregnancy. So you see this feedback system already, or this system, not really feedback yet. Now, for labor, or throughout the duration of pregnancy, as the fetal HPA axis develops, now that same CRH that was released from the placenta is actually going to stimulate the release of androgens, the sex hormones, and the stress hormones, which is cortisol, from the fetal adrenal glands. So it's actually going to stimulate the HPA axis of the fetus. And that's going to flow back. And remember, the androgens are still going to be changed to estrogens or estriol in the placenta. And then that's going to continue to stimulate maternal uterine tissue. Now, before we talked about it stimulated growth, it stimulated blood flow. Now we're actually talking about a more molecular stimulation. So it's actually stimulating the expression of oxytocin receptors. So oxytocin, what do you need to know about that? Let's pause and talk about that. Oxytocin is a hormone that's like the love hormone, but it also stimulates smooth muscle contraction. So when people are breastfeeding and lactating, oxytocin is what is responsible for the letdown sensation. Oxytocin is also responsible for uterine contractions. And so whenever we talked about, normal labor and delivery, we talked about that last phase when the placenta is being delivered, and we want to stimulate uterine contraction to decrease hemorrhaging, right? And so the medicine that we give is actually Pitocin, which is an analog of oxytocin. And so oxytocin stimulates smooth muscle contraction. Now, the other thing to know during pregnancy, oxytocin being released from the pituitary gland is pretty, it has a relatively stable and steady release. So it's not like you just increase and increase and increase it, and then you go into labor. Actually, what happens is your uterus gets more and more and more receptors. And then we'll talk about in a minute how prostaglandins play a role in this process too by increasing the sensitivity of those receptors. So in this process that we're focused on, the placenta releases CRH, which also stimulates the HPA axis of the fetus. The fetus adrenal glands release androgens and cortisol. The androgens, we'll just focus on that, get changed to estriol or estrogens. The estrogen increases the oxytocin receptors on the uterus. And so at some point, with the stimulation of the system, you then have this capacity to respond, because before everything is quiet. And then once you get this like maximal capacity of oxytocin receptors, and once they're sensitive enough to respond to the oxytocin, then you can have the contractions that are needed for labor. And then here is just a different view of it, because we're going to go over it multiple times just so it is clear. Estrogen, and remember before all of this we're talking about, fetal androgens being changed to estrogens in the placenta. And what do the estrogens do? Well, they increase the gap junctions between myometrial cells. What does this mean? Basically, it helps the uterus contract in a coordinated fashion. And then also, it increases the oxytocin receptors in the uterus. So myometrium is just a different word for the muscle of the uterus. Until eventually, it can respond to oxytocin. So it's not the increase of the oxytocin, it's actually the increase of these receptors and the sensitivity of these receptors that help with the contractions that start labor. And we'll talk about one caveat in a minute, but for now, you should get that. Now, it also increases prostaglandin production. Prostaglandin production, we talked about prostaglandins whenever we were talking about inflammation and the inflammatory cascade. And so this should be linked in your brain to inflammation, right? But it also plays a role in promoting labor. onset because it softens the cervix, and it also helps increase the sensitivity of the oxytocin receptors. And then both of these things, all of these things, help stimulate labor. Now, the other thing that happens, and we'll just follow this through, is that once the uterus starts contracting, the fetus, the head, actually pushes against the cervix, right? Because like you have this fetus in the uterus, and when it contracts, there's only one place to go. And so it pushes against the cervix, and there's this reflex that sends a signal to the mom's brain, to the pituitary gland, to release more oxytocin. So, I said before that the onset of labor is not necessarily driven by higher and higher levels of oxytocin. It's really the number of receptors for oxytocin on the uterine wall, and then also the sensitivity of oxytocin receptors. But during labor, you have a positive feedback cycle, and that involves this contraction and this reflex that increases oxytocin release. So during labor, you do have a significant increase in oxytocin. And it's this positive feedback cycle that continues. So let's look at one other view of this, a different view, just to help out, help you get it in your brain. Let's see. Okay. So the placenta secretes CRH, and that stimulates the fetal adrenal glands, right? And so the fetal adrenal glands release sex hormones, they release stress hormones, and we will stick with the sex hormones for now. So the androgens are released. They go back to the placenta. The placenta changes the androgens into estrogens. The estrogens stimulate the uterus. Early on in pregnancy, that means it increases the blood flow and growth. But later on, it also increases the gap junctions, which basically just increase the contractility. You don't have to necessarily memorize that part. And then increases the oxytocin receptors. Okay, so hopefully you have that part by now. If not, go ahead and rewind this and start over. Let's go back to our slides. Okay, so here's just another view of it, right? The other thing to know so here's what we just talked about. The adrenal glands in the fetus release androgens, which get changed into estrogens, and they help increase the prostaglandin receptors, oxytocin receptors, gap junctions, and then that helps stimulate or get the uterus primed for labor eventually. And as we're talking about this, remember that all of this is driven by CRH and that CRH release. And remember, even though we're talking about this in a totally different way, that is also involved in the stress response cycle. And we'll talk about kind of the overflow of it in this lecture. So now, remember later on, as the adrenal gland develops and as the fetus develops, that same CRH that's being released from the placenta has a positive feedback loop and still stimulates the adrenal glands, but not only to release androgens, which we just talked about, but also to release the cortisol, because that's the HPA axis, right? Cortisol plays a huge role in actually preparing the fetus for delivery. It helps stimulate lung development and so many other really important roles of cortisol in terms of preparing the fetus for delivery. But it also increases placental oxytocin release. It also increases prostaglandin release. And remember the prostaglandin, we're still talking about, the same prostaglandins. Those help soften the cervix. Those help basically potentiate or increase all of the effects of estriol in terms of getting the uterus to a contractile state. And they actually increase contractions by themselves. But then cortisol being released from the adrenal glands of the fetus also stimulates placental CRH. And so that's this positive feedback. So CRH in the placenta stimulates the fetal HPA axis, and part of that also stimulates more placental CRH, okay? So it's a little counterintuitive. Don't pay attention to these, just more pay attention to the actual slide and the notes in the slide, because remember, when we're talking about HPA axis in terms of what cortisol does in a non-pregnant, just normal person, it inhibits this, right? It binds to those receptors in the hippocampus, actually, right? Because we know that there's a higher level over here. And then that really is the strong negative feedback, right? But placental CRH is actually stimulated by cortisol, and then cortisol actually stimulates CRH. So looking at this now, this is that really scary, system, but let's go through it. Let's start with CRH. So we're talking about placental CRH being released. This activates the fetal HPA axis, which we just talked about, which would increase cortisol, which would increase CRH, right? Cortisol also increases prostaglandins, which we already talked about. And that helps, basically get the uterus ready to start contracting. CRH in the placenta also increases the release of androgens, which DHEA are the androgens. You already know that. And then the androgens get changed to estrogens in the placenta. We've already talked about that. And then you should know already what estrogens do. They also help prime the uterus for labor, right? By increasing those oxytocin receptors. So the other thing that we have not talked about is what about maternal stress? Because you understand how the HPA axis works in a non-pregnant state in the mom, but how does that interact with this weird positive feedback system of the fetus? Well, it potentiates it. It increases it basically. And so following our chart, maternal stress increases cortisol. And we're talking about cortisol in the blood. Cortisol is a steroid hormone, so it passes through the placenta. So maternal cortisol levels will go straight to the fetus. Like there's no filtering. So maternal stress, her HPA axis is activated. She has an increased amount of cortisol in her blood, which also flows to the fetus. That increase in cortisol stimulates CRH, and you have this whole cycle all over again. The other thing that we didn't talk about is how prostaglandins also increase CRH. So what if we have prostaglandins from an outside source in terms of inflammation, some kind of inflammatory state, some kind of infection, right? Well, that's going to also increase CRH, and that's going to increase this whole cycle. But the maternal stress response is not just the HPA axis, right? So at this point, you should understand this, even though it looks really messy and scary. If not, pause and go over it until you've convinced yourself you've understood it. Next, we'll talk about sympathetic nervous system. Because again, it's not just cortisol, right? You also have epinephrine and all of the effects from that, right? So let's go through this. stress. Okay, we have the HPA axis of the mom, but we also have the catecholamines, which are the norepinephrine, epinephrine, right? What happens when you have an activation of your sympathetic nervous system? What happens on the vasculature? It creates vasoconstriction, right? And remember, the placenta is all vasculature. And so what happens to uterine blood flow, or what happens to fetal blood flow and that flow of nutrients and oxygen? It decreases, right? And so an increase in stress not only activates the HPA axis, which starts this whole cycle or amplifies this whole cycle to get the uterus primed for delivery and the fetal organs primed for delivery, but it also decreases blood flow. And that decrease in placental blood flow actually stresses out the fetus and triggers the fetal HPA axis. So so again, you see the positive feedback of the placental CRH on both the mom and the fetus. And so this is like another amplification of this whole entire cycle. And so looking at what catecholamines do in a different way, increase in blood pressure, let's see. So, and it's dose dependent, right? Increase in uterine muscle tone and contractions, vasoconstriction, increase in placental CRH. All of these, the CRH can lead to preterm birth. The fall in uterine blood flow can lead to IUGR, which is intrauterine growth restriction, which is basically a small baby. And from our fetal origins of adult disease, you guys know that like the birth weight of a baby predicts, one, the environment, the prenatal environment, but also future lifelong health issues, right? So going through this stress, no matter what it is, remember, like our stress response is the same, whether we're trying to like survive conflict and war, whether we're trying to run away from a bear, whether we are stressed out about like bills or whatever, right? Or if we have an infection or a loss of blood flow or whatever, it's all the same stress response. It's like super ingrained in our body. And so that psychological stress might also be associated with certain maternal health behaviors. You guys have seen the video of the rabbit ear with exposed to tobacco or nicotine and how that causes a vasoconstriction. So, you know, one of the reasons why people smoke cigarettes is also like a stress release, right? So that can amplify everything, but let's just go with the stress. You know about the stress response, that increases CRH, but it also increases that prostaglandin and some of the inflammation associated with stimulating uterine contractions, right? It also increases the fetal HPA axis. And that can all lead to preterm birth. One more image, and this is all just kind of saying the same thing. So we'll skip down to here. Uterus in mid-pregnancy, everything is quiet. Cervix remains long and closed. The mucus plug is present. And that mucus plug actually helps protect the baby from infections as well. But it also helps hold everything in. The prostaglandins work on the cervix and on that mucus plug. And so, and then you see a familiar term, reactive oxygen species, right? Because they also play a role. But basically you have these changes that lead to a stimulation of the uterine muscle. You have this upregulation of the receptors, but you also have some mechanical activation, which we talked about. And some of that is like uterine stretch, which we'll talk about too, but some of that is also whenever the head bounces down or squeezes down by the cervix. And then, you know, inflammation, uterine contraction, that can result in labor, whether it's term or preterm. So the other thing that we had not talked about is this uterine stretch reflex, because we talked about when the head is kind of squeezed down by the cervix and how that increases the oxytocin. But that also happens as the baby gets bigger. And so as the baby gets bigger, there are actually stretch receptors that are activated in the uterus. And that triggers the release of oxytocin from the mom, and the oxytocin causes uterine muscles to contract, once the uterus is primed for contraction. So why is this relevant? This isn't necessarily relevant to our discussion about maternal stress and the onset of labor, but it is relevant in terms of like multiple gestations and why twins and triplets and quadruplets are almost always associated with preterm labor, because the more that you stretch out the uterus, the more that it triggers this response and this oxytocin release, but still the uterus has to be primed for labor. The other reason why it's relevant is with like gestational diabetes. When you have a larger baby than you expect, that might also be associated with preterm delivery because you've stretched out the uterine cavity more. So just a review of how this is all very relevant to premature delivery. You can have this premature, and basically what this means is like you've primed the uterus too early, and that is through all of that stress response, right? This is just saying it in a different way. You can have an infection, which that would lead to inflammation, right? You can have prostaglandin release from amion, and that could be due to that excessive stretch, or due to, again, this. You could have placental abruption, which that kind of, that's when the placenta tears away from the wall, right? But basically you still have the prostaglandins, and you have the same process, whether it's term or preterm. It's just that everything is primed a lot earlier whenever it's preterm. And then we know that there are effects like prenatal programming, right? Whenever babies are exposed to like extreme stress during prenatal life, then we have this programming that can really affect their health whenever they're adults. And then that can lead to adult disease, but it feeds back, right? Because when they get pregnant, when they are pregnant with all of these things, and then we start this whole cycle over, and this just perpetuates it. And so imagine, a mother who is stressed significantly, and now you know the pathophysiology for how that primes both the fetus and the uterus for preterm delivery, right? But also maybe small birth weight, or IUGR, low birth weight. So you know how that occurs, but you know that there's also some programming of future disease risks. And then when they're adults and they have this tendency for these future, diseases like glucose intolerance or diabetes and hypertension, and high cholesterol and obesity and all of these other things, when they're pregnant, it's just going to be an amplified response. And so this is that transgenerational inheritance of the effects of stress. I do want to just review before we go on one other thing, because I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but so cortisol and catecholamines, I briefly mentioned before how these are actually really important hormones for priming the fetus for delivery, because it helps stimulate lung development, especially. So these are all the different ways that they affect different organs and help stimulate development. And so one of the, I don't know, one of the things that we usually see, one of the observations that we usually make are, certain babies do really well in the NICU. They're actually much more biologically, physiologically prepared. And that's usually, little Black babies and other babies of color. They do really, really well in the neonatal period, right in the NICU, because oftentimes of the stress that their moms have gone through to prime them to get ready, for the world. Now, in terms of health inequities later on, we're going to talk about that during the next lecture.